My name is Johnny Burtka, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative. I'd like to welcome you to our annual gala. I'm grateful for your attendance at our VIP reception and for your generosity and your friendship over the years. We have the special opportunity to spend a half an hour with tonight's keynote speaker, J.D.Vance, as well as with our editor, Jim Antle, and our senior editor, Dreher, to get a sneak peek into JD's talk tonight. So without further ado, I'll pass things on to Rod.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Please take your seats, and we're going to spend a little bit of time, Jim and I, with JD, and give you a little preview of what he's going to say tonight to the gala, and also just maybe show you the softer side of J.D.Vance. So, JD, I think the question that's on everybody's mind here, and maybe it's a little personal, maybe even a little metaphysical, but I'm going to throw it out there. Who's going to play you in the movie? There's going to be a movie of Hillbilly Elegy, by the way. Ron Howard is making it. So who's going to play you?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for doing this, Rod. Good to see you, Jim. Appreciate this. But the person who's playing me in the movie, his name is Gabriel Basso. I'd be shocked if any person in the room heard that name before. He's from Missouri, which was really important to me. I wanted somebody who was from at least kind of the same region of the country that I'm from. But the budget for the movie went to Glenn Close, who's playing Mamaw. So
Glenn Close is playing Mamaw? Glenn
Close is playing Mamaw. So
they
didn't have that much time to spend on JD, which is fine with me.
Has everybody here read the book? Because if you have not, it is one of the most remarkable books, remarkable memoirs in our literary history, and I'm not exaggerating here. It's really tremendous. And the fact that it's going to be made into a film is, I think, is such an honor, but it's also going to get the message out. And I'd like to ask you, people look to you now for your political insights, and your policy insights, but you told a story. You know, you embedded this not in a book, a policy book or a book of nonfiction. You told all this embedded in a true story about your family, and I think that's what people responded to. Can you talk a little bit about why this storytelling was such an effective way of talking about some political and cultural problems we're dealing with in America?
Sure. Well, you know, one thing I really wanted to have a reader take away from Hillbilly Elegy was these problems are really complicated and they're really difficult. And the people who are confronting these problems are incredibly decent, but also in some ways very troubled and struggling with a lot of very real problems. And I thought it would be hard to do that if I just reproduced a lot of academic research. And also, I'm not an academic researcher, and so it's not really my wheelhouse. You know, smarter and better credentialed people than me can focus on that. But I thought if people actually experienced these problems through characters and real people that they could identify with, and actually saw how it happened, and they felt some real attachment to the people that I grew up around, they would not be so quick to judge or so quick to cast aspersions, but they would really try to identify with and understand what was going on in the lives of people. And so it did actually start out, and Rod, you and I have talked about this, it started out as a policy book. It was a pure policy book. But the more that I wrote it, the more that I realized that my unique value add was that I could relate to these problems not as an abstract theoretician, but as somebody who had actually experienced them. And, you know, I think that ultimately that wisdom, while I was resistant to it, at first has ultimately been borne out. You know, if you experiencing these problems through the medium of an interesting sociology paper is one thing, but if you read about my mamaw and my sister and my mom and me, that's something quite different. And ultimately it landed, it hit for a lot of reasons, some luck and some not, but I'm glad that people are at least thinking about these problems, if nothing else.
JD, the success of Hillbilly Elegy sort of coincided with Donald Trump becoming a political phenomenon, leaving reality TV behind and bringing reality TV to Washington. What in the Trump phenomenon, is there something that you can identify in the Trump phenomenon that resonated really with people that you grew up with and the people you know? And what do we maybe in Washington, even in year 2, you're going on year 3 of this man being the president, What is it that maybe people in the Beltway miss about the Trump phenomenon when we talk about it here?
Yeah, so it's funny. I have this email from November of 2015, and I emailed my editor, and I had just been home for Thanksgiving. At the time, we lived in San Francisco, I guess, and I'd just been home for Thanksgiving, and I emailed the editor of the book, and it would come out in June of 2016. And I said, I think this Trump thing is really going to happen. And the response that he sent immediately was, no, he's more like Herman Cain or Michelle Bachmann in 2012. He's going to flame out. Trust me about this. And I said, no, I don't think that he is. There's something different about this. There's something substantively different. So my answer to this question is that there's both a substance piece of Trump and there's a process piece of Trump. So the substance piece of Trump, which we can talk about in more detail, but pretty straightforwardly, is he was explicitly attacking the libertarian consensus that I think had animated much of Republican economic thinking, and frankly, much of the neocon consensus that had animated Republican foreign policy thinking for 2-3 decades. I remember so vividly when he said during a debate, we're not going to let people die in the streets when talking about healthcare. And everybody said, oh, you can't say that in a Republican primary. And at the same time, I'm getting text messages from my friends and family back home, finally, somebody's saying we're not going to let people die in the streets. That was really powerful. But there's also a process piece of Trump, which is that he talks about politics and public policy in a way that's super identifiable. I imagine that most of the people in this room are either familiar with or maybe have even read Christopher Lasch's book, The Revolt of the Elites. But one of the consequences of call it a meritocracy, call it an elite that has segregated itself into these narrow corners of the country, DuPont Circle, Brooklyn, San Francisco, is that after a while you start to lose your muscle memory for how to actually talk like the rest of the country talks. And Donald Trump was a reality TV star whose entire livelihood was in some ways built around talking like, quote unquote, real America actually talked. And he's outrageous and he says some pretty ridiculous things, but that's how normal people actually talk. Rod, if you and I have a conversation, God, I would hate if one of our emails or, God forbid, one of our phone conversations got out into the public ether.
It will one day.
Yeah, I'm sure that Tim Cook is recording it every single iPhone conversation we have, but it's so different from the way that somebody like Jeb Bush talks about politics and public policy. It sounds like the guy drafted up a speech, filtered it through an army of consultants and political advisors, and then it came out on the other end sounding like something that was written by a robot, because maybe it was written by a robot.
Delivered by a robot.
It's certainly delivered by a robot. But I think that there's something about the political rhetoric of Trump that is still, to answer your question, Jim, that is still underexplored and underappreciated. He doesn't talk like a phony zombie. He talks like a normal person, and a lot of people look down on that. And sometimes, of course, he doesn't always put things in the way that other people would like, but he's real, and there's something to be said for actually just saying what you think and not sounding like a zombie or a robot when you say it.
So what's your verdict on the Trump presidency so far?
Well, I'm certainly a critic of the Trump campaign during the campaign, as you well know, Rod. I think that there are two things on which he's been a wild success, and it's tough to overstate how much he's been a success. So one is that he's completely transformed American policy on China. And I happen to think that we should be approaching China as we should have approached Nazi Germany in the early 1930s. And the fact that he's changed elite discourse on that question is just a remarkable achievement. We'll see if some positive policy consequences from it, but he's certainly nailed the China issue in a way that no American president has for the past 20 or 30 years. The second thing that really is to his credit is that unlike George W. Bush and unlike Barack Obama, he didn't start a really stupid war in the Middle East. Now, he hasn't ended all of our stupid wars in the Middle East, but he hasn't started one either. And that is, by the standards of the past 2 decades of American presidents, that's a pretty significant accomplishment. Soft
bigotry of low expectations.
So I think that, frankly, he's been more of a success than I thought he would be. And I'll talk a little bit about this tonight. But the problem, I think, ultimately with the Trump administration is not a problem of Trump. It's a problem of the Republican Party. And if you spend time in these circles, if you spend time among think tank folks, if you spend time among, all these fine people in the audience, you realize how utterly captured the American right has been by a certain political philosophy. Call it social liberalism, fiscal conservatism, call it libertarianism, but there is a way in which Trump has stepped knee-deep into waters that were fundamentally unwilling to go as far as he might like to go on a lot of different policy proposals and ideas. And when I think about the tax cut legislation, which was okay, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. If I think about the healthcare legislation, which I think was genuinely a moral and political disaster, and I'm glad that it never passed, what has happened is that Paul Ryan and a lot of the Republican leadership effectively governed the Republican domestic agenda, and what they did is what a Jeb Bush presidency or a Marco Rubio presidency would have done. And what I think that shows is that you need more than just politicians with good instincts. You actually need an institution on the right that is much more deeply ingrained into the apparatus of policymaking.
That kind of leads to a question I had in mind, which is, they did have that unusual governing partnership between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump for the first 2 years. And they really, in certain ways, were diametrically opposed in terms of what they wanted to do. But one advantage that Ryan had, aside from the donor class and aside from substantial Washington experience and aside from being sort of a poster child for a lot of the conservative press, is that whatever the flaws of the Ryan roadmap, he had one. He had a detailed policy agenda that said from point A to point Z what he wanted to do, whether he had a consensus behind it or not, even within his own party, or whether there were flaws with the details of that program. There is a lot in Trump's instincts that are clearly sound, and there have been a lot of really good critiques of, as you say, some of the libertarian economic consensus on the right, certainly of the neoconservative foreign policy consensus on the right. On that latter point, ending the wars is a positive program. But for some of the economic populism, what will it take to go beyond sort of re-examining first principles to actually having a policy agenda where you can say from point A to point Z what you would do if you were in office?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as much as I don't like the answer, I have to give it because I actually believe it. I think that we either have to take over or create a number of different institutions across official and elite policymaking circles in D.C. There are some folks who are sympathetic, I think, to our way of thinking. A few folks at Heritage, a few folks at AEI. The American conservative is certainly sympathetic to the way that we think about these issues. American Affairs, National Affairs, pretty interesting scholarly journals that are thinking about these issues. But the institutions on the right are so nascent for actually turning economic populism and economic nationalism into a governing philosophy and a set of policy proposals that we need to create them, or at least take over the ones that already exist. Paul Ryan definitely had a roadmap, A to Z, the things that he wanted to accomplish, but he also had multiple well-funded institutions behind him, dozens of think tank fellows, maybe hundreds of intellectuals who were supporting that agenda, figuring out what it looked like, trying to figure out, what does this particular impulse in tax policy mean when translated into legislation? What does this particular regulatory idea mean when turned into something that's going to get filed in the Code of Federal Regulations? That's what we don't have. We're starting to build it a little bit. We're starting to grow it a little bit. But I was talking just earlier today with one of my very dear friends who works in this world, and he's about to start a project that I think we'll all hear about in a few weeks that's along these lines. And what was so hard about our conversation is after bouncing ideas around on email and during phone conversations, and certainly during this meeting that we had earlier today, we could not name 15 people that you would hire if you started a think tank tomorrow built around the ideas of economic populism from the right. So we have a lot of institutional work to do. Again, we need a lot more politicians with good instincts, but we actually need the institutions of a robust and dynamic American right that exists for the good of the American nation.
You know, many people may not know that your wife, Usha, you met her at Yale Law School. She's extremely accomplished herself. She clerked for the Chief Justice. You guys lived in Washington on Capitol Hill. So, but you chose, when her clerkship was over, you chose to move back to your home state of Ohio. You were part of the D.C. inner circle, and you chose to turn your back on it. Tell me about that tension between living back in Ohio and D.C. What do people in D.C. need to know about the people of Ohio? And conversely, what do the people of Ohio need to know about the people you used to move among in D.C.? Because I think that there's a certain amount of reverse snobbery out there. I live in Louisiana, and I'm glad to be there. I'm glad I'm not in Washington anymore, but at the same time, there's a lot that people, in deep red America don't understand about the way Washington works. And I think they have a lot of fear and loathing of Washington that may not be entirely justified.
Well, yeah, you're right. My wife clerked for the Chief Justice. She also, I don't think a lot of people know this, but before she clerked for the Chief Justice a couple years earlier, she had clerked for then D.C. Circuit Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And so, Trump's popularity in the eyes of the Vance household went up pretty substantially during the Kavanaugh fight. But the tension between living in a place that has all of the amenities and has all of the relationships that you have when you run in some of these circles, there is a real tension between sort of staying connected to those roots and going and staying connected back to the roots that made you who you were. And it finds its expression in a number of different ways. I mean, we live in Cincinnati, which is not an extremely prosperous city by the standards of D.C., but it's not southeastern Kentucky coal country. It's not Middletown, Ohio, where I grew up. And so, it was sort of our nice little compromise between living in a decent enough sized city that there were good restaurants and things like that, but where we could still spend a lot of quality time with my family, who lives about 45 minutes away, or at least most of them do. So I wouldn't say that I've quite figured out that tension, and even the sort of the Ohio versus DC tension sometimes has a much more local flavor. You hear people in Middletown complain about folks in Columbus, and vice versa. And so it is in some ways much more of I'd say a rural/ex-urban versus urban divide than it is necessarily purely about geography. But I guess, if I'm trying to be kind to the people in D.C.,
Don't feel that compunction.
Yeah. Rod's kind of set me up here. I have to say something nice about the people in D.C. I'm sweating here as I stall verbally. But the thing that I would say is that there is, I think, a certain failure to appreciate just how important it is to be involved or at least knowledgeable about what's going on in this town if you want to solve the problems that people back home confront every day. I forget who wrote this, but I really identified with it. There's this sense in which we assume that middle America is not capable of participating meaningfully in American democracy. They vote for candidates, but they don't have sophisticated views about what's going on in Washington, D.C. And I think in some cases, middle America has taken the bait a little bit. This is not, the Norman Rockwell America where people are super engaged in the process of government. I think consequently they miss something about what's going on in D.C. and they're not as able to push back against things they don't like and support the things that they do like as if they were a little bit more actively involved. And I think, in D.C., the thing that people miss, there are a lot of them, but the primary, or at least a very important thing that I'd point out is that they miss that there's a core values difference. Again, this is something I'll talk a little bit about later tonight, but the people who I grew up around, they don't want to be major party politicians. They don't want to run Fortune 500 companies. They just want to have a nice job, and they want to go to work, and they want to support their family, and they want to be good husbands and wives and moms and dads. And that values difference really animates so much of what's wrong about DC. I think, Ross Douthat, who I think is going to be here later on today.
Sure. Hey, he's here tonight.
Ross is here. Oh, there he is. The last time I drunk bourbon with Ross, God threw a wine glass at him for talking bad about Pope Francis. So if you're into Catholic mysticism, talk to Ross later on tonight. But there's a way in which modern American meritocracy, which again is sort of secluded and cordoned off large segments of people away from the rest of the country, has made people think that like being an entrepreneur or being a best-selling author or going to an elite law school is the end-all be-all of human existence, that climbing the corporate ladder is more important than just finding some very basic fulfillment in life. And I wish that people realized in DC that they're not governing a country that's really like them in a lot of ways. They're governing a country that wants more simple and, frankly, in a lot of ways, more pure things out of life. And if they had that in mind, they would realize, one, I think it's a little bit less difficult. It is, as a mathematical fact, impossible to get every kid who grew up in my circumstances to go to Yale Law School. It's a little bit more possible to get every kid who grew up in my circumstances into a middle-class job where they have a healthy, successful marriage.
What do you say? It seems to me that the political party that figures out how to bring white working class voters and non-white working class voters together in some meaningful way and deliver on some of their economic aspirations could own our country's politics for a generation. But that seems like a very difficult thing to do, in part because the Democrats don't hold the more culturally conservative values of a large portion of the white working class, but also because strains of the left have a condescension towards some of those people, almost bordering on something equivalent to the racism that is often attributed to these types of voters and to people, these Americans. What realistically could be done to sort of bridge some of that divide, which clearly the president, some of his biggest detractors, one of the biggest criticisms has been his inability to reach just beyond the white working class, although his numbers among non-white voters are actually not worse than the usual bad numbers of Republicans. But still, it clearly he has inflamed certain tensions. Is there a way to sort of present this economic populism in a way that reaches a potentially much larger audience and more diverse audience of people?
Yeah, I hope so. And I think probably yes, but I do worry that the answer is no. One of the hidden strengths of the Joe Biden presidential campaign, and people talk a lot about his potential appeal with white working class voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and so forth. But Joe Biden is really popular among working and middle class black voters who are not crazy. And what people miss about the Democratic Party, if you spend your life on Twitter, is that it's not a party run by Chapo Trap House, right? It's a party that's run by often church-going middle-class black Americans in the suburbs of South Carolina and Atlanta and other places. And those people are not especially radical, especially on social and cultural issues. They don't maybe love the president's rhetoric when it comes to racial issues, but they are certainly not willing to bet the farm on a radical who is going to totally upend American society. They're actually pretty happy with how things are going. They're pretty happy with the broad direction of the country. So to me, the answer to your question is, can the Democrats either get a large segment of the white working class back, or can the Republicans get a large segment of the Hispanic and black working class? And I guess my big concern is that the racial tensions that exist in American society for a whole host of complex historical and cultural reasons are basically never really worked out. And what you have is a permanent war between a party of elite white liberals and minorities on the one hand, and middle class, primarily white Americans on the other hand, and that never really resolves itself. It's constantly, they're constantly at each other's throat, and neither one of them gains a significant upper hand that allows them to actually go after major change and actually move the country in a pretty significant direction. My hope, and I think this is probably going to happen, this is certainly my friend Mike Lynn's view. He's a brilliant political scientist out of UT Austin. Mike's view is that eventually the cultural radicalism of the elite part of the Democratic Party is going to force enough of the black and brown working and middle class out of the Democratic Party. They'll go to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party will be forced to moderate its racial politics in response to that. And so his view is that you have these periods, typically 20, 30, 40 years, where there is a dominant force in American politics. It was the LBGA coalition from the the FDR coalition from the 30s to the 60s. It was arguably the Reagan coalition through the 80s and the 90s. And his view is that a populist conservatism is going to be the dominant coalition maybe from 2025 on. I hope that's true, but I fear that it's not.
Real quick, what's your read on the Democratic field? Which is the candidate that you most fear would beat President Trump? And which of the candidates do you think, if they did win, would be better for America? Which ones do you think would be, as president, would be worse for America?
Yeah, so I did this event at the Yale Federalist Society recently where they asked me for my 3 favorite Democrats purely in terms of policy outcomes. And I said, in order, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Tulsi Gabbard. And the reason is that, one, I think those are the 3 candidates who are least crazy on the cultural issues in the Democratic Party. And 2, I think those are the candidates that are least likely to start another stupid war in the Democratic Party. And so if I'm picking from a field that I don't especially like, those are the 3 that I would have to pick. Who do I fear the most? You know, I think the polls are probably pretty accurate and that Biden is a pretty big threat to Trump, especially in the industrial Midwest. I think that the conventional wisdom that Trump wins in a walk-off with Bernie Sanders is probably not right. I think Bernie Sanders is a much stronger candidate for some of the same reasons that Trump was a pretty strong candidate. I don't especially fear Elizabeth Warren as an electoral threat to Republicans, in part because I think the country's still pretty angry about what's going on. And Elizabeth Warren just isn't very good at being angry. Biden and Sanders, they're pretty good at being angry. And the rest of the candidates, I don't think they have a great chance. I think the person that I least want to see as president is Kamala Harris. It's almost impossible to imagine a person whose combination of sort of cultural liberalism and elitism less aligns with my own politics. But I also don't think she has a great chance of winning the nomination. Thank God.
Well, my dream, I said this on my blog before, my dream election would be someday seeing you versus Pete Buttigieg running for president.
Oh, God. I think we're out of time, right? That's so,
that'd be a hell of a campaign.
Yeah, I met Mayor Pete, as he's called, because I have no idea how to pronounce his name.
Yeah, that's good that he has that easy first
name. That's right.
Yeah.
I met him once, and we actually talked for a while about sort of his broad view of the world. And the problem with Mayor Pete is that I think that he actually is an incredibly boring and standard politician who's good at pretending that he's not. And, Pete Buttigieg is basically a less compelling version in terms of public policy than as Joe Biden. Like, why is Mayor Pete running for president? I don't know. He's a nice guy. He seems like a very friendly person. I'm sure that he's good to his friends and family. But I don't know why he's running for president. So if that's your dream election and I lose, then I'll feel very terrible about myself.
Well, I'll tell you why he's running and why he's so good. I read in the New Yorker this week that he taught himself Norwegian while sitting on the toilet at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And I'm not actually making that up. That's in the New Yorker this week. You ever do anything like that?
Even Pig Latin, perhaps?
No. Well, I am fluent in Pig Latin, but as a good, proud American hillbilly, Rod, I speak English, and that's the only language I speak.
Hell yeah.
mean, it seems to me that Bernie and Biden, if Trump were to run against either of those two, he would have completely different campaign approaches. You can kind of redo the same campaign he ran against Hillary against Biden, because Biden is vulnerable in the same types of issues of being a conventional Washington type. He also supported a lot of the trade deals, supported the wars. Then the question becomes, does that still have credibility given Trump's failure to deliver on a number of his populist campaign agenda items that differentiated him from other Republicans? Against Bernie Sanders, he has to, I think, try to fight a more conventional left-right campaign, because he's going to contrast himself with Bernie the socialist. And Bernie the socialist, however, can take away the issues, or at least partially negate, and compete with him on the issues of trade and ending the wars. So, if you get a Trump versus Bernie campaign, is Trump effectively going to turn into Paul Ryan? Or will we get a competition between which of the two major party candidates can end the wars faster and figure out the trade problem faster, figure out the deindustrialization problem faster?
Yeah, my fear is that we get the former, that running against Bernie Sanders, the incentives would just be so powerful for Trump to run as a very conventional Republican. I think it would be a terrible mistake, and he would probably lose. I really think, I think I said this publicly 3 years ago, that I thought Trump would run against Bernie in 2020, and I thought if he did, Bernie would win. I think that's a very real possibility. I'm actually more persuaded that Biden's a pretty strong candidate than I was back then. But the problem with running against Bernie in this hyper-conventional way is that, again, people are still pretty frustrated at a fundamental way. There is still this sense, despite the fact that the economy is good and wages have been going up for the past year or so, that there's something fundamentally broken. And if Trump is running not as the candidate of change, then I think that really does hurt him. I wouldn't underestimate Biden's political strength. I mean, yeah, Trump would probably run a similar campaign against Biden that he did against Hillary Clinton. Biden has the advantage that he's not just annoying and shrill and terrible in the way that Hillary Clinton was. I mean, she was an unbelievably unpopular figure in the parts of the country that she really needed to win. The conventional wisdom is, of course, that she should have spent more time in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And I wonder if she'd spent more time in Pennsylvania if the margin for Trump had even been larger. I really, does she actually appeal to that group of voters? I don't think so. Biden will. And Biden is very good at not seeming like a cultural radical, which is really the issue. People didn't dislike Hillary Clinton because of her economic policy proposals. They disliked Hillary Clinton because of the perception, I think probably right, that she hated people like them, or at least looked down on them. Biden is going to be much better at avoiding that. And the way that he handled this, weird touching shoulder massage issue, the fact that he basically said, forget about it. I'm a weird guy. I'm an old guy. I got to learn, but that's it. I'm not going to apologize for this. I'm not going to prostrate myself before modern cultural elites. That shows some real political wisdom that I think a lot of folks in the Democratic Party, at least the Democratic leadership, don't have.
One thing that has alarmed me about Trump is the way he talks in a pretty demagogic way about the media. On the other hand, when I see things like the way the media handle the Covington Catholic boys, I find myself, against my better instincts, wanting Trump to give them hell. Talk about the role that media and hatred of the media plays in this political cycle, because I can't quite get over the fact that the media is so, even now, so clueless about itself. And they're just, it seems like they're falling all over themselves to help Trump's case.
Yeah, so I agree with you, and I would point to the same exact case. The Covington Catholic incident was, Covington Catholic, funny little side story. I was in a fantasy football league with a couple of federal judges who were all sitting in Covington, and the judge who I worked for at the time, he's very devout Catholic, sends his kids to the rival school to Covington Catholic in Northern Kentucky. And so my fantasy football team name is, to this day, Cov Cath Colonels, because I just wanted to antagonize this guy. And I thought about that when this Covington Catholic thing came up, because I thought about posting on Twitter, like, oh, here's a funny joke about how I was the Covington Catholic Colonels in my fantasy football league. And I knew that if I did that, people would pounce. They would actually get frustrated about the fact that I was making light of these horrible Covington Catholic kids who taunted an innocent Native American guy. And of course, as we know, the story as it came out was much different. The kids basically did either nothing or nothing that significant wrong. They were being taunted. They reacted at worst as you would expect a bunch of high school kids to do, and their entire lives were in some ways ruined. I mean, they were national reporters, people who had never cared about, let's say, the opioid epidemic when it was ravaging this community, who were parked outside of their high school to try to get a glimpse of these kids because they did nothing wrong, but the media misfired so significantly. So to me, I agree with you that I wish that the Republican Party didn't have such an antagonistic relationship with the press right now. But when I think about what's going on in the press, I just see it as a symptom of a much larger cultural problem in this country. We've seen the decline of pretty much, well, not all, but a significant number of small and mid-sized city newspapers. Even newspapers like the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Columbus Dispatch are struggling. They're shrinking. They're running fewer advertisements. They're laying off staff. And what's happening is that if you're a national news reporter who spends 90% of your time in New York or DC, you just don't know the rest of the people that you share a country with. It is impossible. There's no way to culturally hack. There's no way to read Hillbilly Elegy and say you get real America. That's just not how it works. You understand people if you actually share a community with them, if they're your neighbors, if they're your friends, if they're your enemies. But you got to live amongst people to actually understand them. And I don't think that a single person could have looked at how the media reacted to the Covington Catholic situation and said anything other than, this is an alien group of people who were reporting on my own community in a way that's very destructive, very hurtful, and ultimately very damaging. I mean, I forget the kid's name, Nick, I forget his last name. Nick Sandman. He had his life ruined for weeks over this issue, and maybe even longer than that. And I just cannot believe how terrible those people reacted to that situation. And I don't know that there's any solution to that problem. I mean, there is no way for them to just have a moment of reckoning, to decide that they're going to cover, quote unquote, real America a little bit more effectively, and to, find some happy balance or some compromise with the country that they're covering. It just doesn't work out like that. I mean, you guys probably had some exposure to this, but I was doing a ton of TV news around the time of the 2016 election. And I was in New York City. I think I did a CBS thing, and then I get a call around 11 from an ABC producer who said, hey, our internal numbers, maybe it was earlier, but our internal numbers are suggesting that Trump may actually win this thing. Can you come in and talk about it? And I went in, and you would have thought that every single person had just lost a significant relative, that everybody's mom had died, every single person, from the producers to the actual talent. And it's not just the grieving, it's not just the sadness over the fact that Trump won that suggests the disconnect, it's the surprise that Trump won. If you look at the election polls running up, they suggested Hillary Clinton had she was the slight favorite going into Election Day, maybe a 60-40 chance of winning. If you were that shocked that Trump won, then you need to be in a different business other than telling people what you think is the truth.
Well, I think we have to wrap up. Let's move into to the rest of the evening. I want to thank you, J.D., for coming to Washington to be with us, and thank you, everybody, for supporting this magazine. And I hope that we can continue to be a strong voice for reform conservatism. And I know for sure that we're going to be hearing from you in the future, J.D. So thanks again.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, J.D.